We're breaking down episode 9 of season 2 of Transformers Generation 1. This is Atlantis Arise. Let's get into the episode. This is Energon Entries. Welcome to Energon Entries, everybody. As always, this is your host, Matt Freites. I want to welcome everybody back to this podcast. It is another Friday, another episode. We are continuing deeper into season 2. I've been having a great time doing this podcast. We're already at episode 25 of this podcast. It's pretty crazy. Started this back in October, took some time off, saw people were subscribing, continued to do content once I got it back up running, and it's been so much fun since then. We're getting into the episode called Atlantis Arise this time. This was an interesting one, but let's get into the episode recap. The episode begins with Soundwave summoning Megatron to the control room after Laserbeak and Buzzsaw detect massive underwater energy readings. The Decepticons encounter the Sub-Atlanticans, a race planning to conquer the surface world, and Megatron negotiates a deal with their king, Nergil. Meanwhile, near the Autobot base, Spike, Bumblebee, and Hound are playing football with the Dinobots until Wheeljack alerts them to the energy reading near the Decepticon base. Optimus Prime dispatches a team to investigate, but they are attacked and Wheeljack gets captured. The Decepticons and Sub-Atlanticans raise Sub-Atlantica and plan to attack Washington, D.C., using a magnetic dysfunction ray developed by Nergil to disable the Autobots. The Autobots, with help from the Dinobots, manage to counterattack, leading to a climactic battle in Sub-Atlantica. The episode ends with Nergil triggering a chain reaction that destroys Sub-Atlantica, forcing the Autobots and Decepticons to retreat as the underwater city sinks back beneath the waves. We start this episode off with the old narrator. I love this voice. I've said this before, but I do have to ask a fundamental question is I wonder how they decided back then when this guy would be used. It makes sense to me that they do it in multiple part episodes, and I didn't think this was a multiple part episode, but the way that it started, I thought maybe it is. They're trying to give me some context here. So I thought that was interesting. Now, in the summary, I mentioned Buzzsaw, but as I'm watching this episode, of course, I see a yellow laser beak. At the time, there's no explanation of what it is. There's more cassette vultures, as Megatron called them, which is interesting because I'm like, how does he know what a cassette is? It's interesting that they call them vultures, but I don't know what this yellow laser beak is, and hopefully we'll find it out later. Now, they find this Sub-Atlantica, and I'm talking about the Decepticons here, and Starscream is like in full extra form here, and twice in about 10 seconds it seems. He's super hasty and he gets hurt. Nearly kills himself trying to run into the city. Nearly kills himself trying to attack them. He doesn't know anything about it. He's just ready to go. And it's funny because Starscream really isn't that much of a go-getter most of the time, but here, very hasty behavior. So the Sub-Atlanticans, in my opinion, the way that they look, they are cliched sea creatures. They have gills, or at least they look like it. They're sort of lizard-like. It's almost, again, as if you asked AI to create Sub-Atlantican people, what would they look like? And again, this is the 80s, a lot of cliches, and that's where they came from. The funny part is they're very trusting, but they're also not trusting. So they meet the Decepticons, they say, you're just like surface dwellers, but then somehow Megatron is able to sort of negotiate his way in there. But you can tell, just by the way they're talking to each other, neither side really digs what the other side is doing in terms of a vibe. So that is something to watch. And when we pan over to the Autobots, they're playing football. And I understand it. I understand that Spike is trying to teach them Americanized ways, or at least Earth ways. But obviously, it just looks ridiculous. And Spike has this uniform that has Spike across it, which is just so cheesy. And it's so Spike at the same time. And I'm thinking, again, he's like 14 years old, so he's going to be a great quarterback against these giant robots. And I get it. It was trying to be a fun scene of seeing the Autobots sort of assimilating to the Earth a little bit more. It just didn't have that effect to me. And so Wheeljack comes and he tells them that they're seeing all these readings. And the Autobots, obviously with Optimus Prime, they're like, look, we got to go do this. We got to take care of this. And they're rolling out. And then here comes Spike. Wait for me. and I died. I just died because Spike is somebody who they should be leaving behind because he doesn't really provide a lot of help. A lot of times they have to rescue him, and they almost left him behind, but he was able to get a ride with Bumblebee. And again, I still think they should be leaving him behind. So the Autobots, in order to get to Sub-Atlantica, they have to go on water. And at first, they're driving on top of water. And my mind tells me, as an adult, that they have some way to do this, but they don't really show how they do it. And then, of course, they go under the water. Now, again, this is fiction, and they're robots, and they're aliens, but we all know that cars don't drive underwater. Even with a snorkel kit, you have to have some part of your car getting air to the engine. I assume they don't have a real combustion engine, so they can drive underwater, but this just sort of goes back to they drive everywhere. How did they get there? Because again, we seem to think, or at least it seems, that their base is somewhere in like Tennessee or something like that. That's a long ass drive to get to Washington, D.C. and to get to the Atlantic, because it's not as if it's like right off the coast. It's out in the Atlantic. So they drive everywhere, very inefficient in my opinion, but hey, it is what it is. But then after this whole battle takes place and everything, now we find out that Buzzsaw is the name of the yellow laser beak, but all these things happen. Wheeljack gets captured, and really he doesn't get captured, he sort of sacrifices himself. But while the Autobots are going back, we see they have skis, so there's a little bit more continuity there. We find out, okay, there's actually a way that they're doing this. In this battle, a lot of things happen, lots of explosions, many things happen, and you see that they're sort of planting the seeds for dissension between the Decepticons and the Sub-Atlanticans. But Wheeljack gets captured, and Nergil tells his people something telepathically because that's the power that they have. And Megatron got smart. He used Soundwave to try to really translate what they're saying, and he finds out that they're going to use Wheeljack to make weapons, and they're going to potentially use those weapons against the Decepticons. So both of these evil sides are trying to plot against each other, and honestly, I think that it's smart for them to watch out and be a little bit wary. So Megatron and crew, they take the Sub-Atlantican people and Sub-Atlantica in general to Washington, D.C. And he says this is the first stop in taking over the world. And I think that's smart. I mean, in terms of the United States, if you're going to take over a city, and this is the city that I live in, Washington, D.C. would be it. However, we all know that there's like a succession of government and things like that. So it's not as if just being here would somehow take over the entire United States, but obviously having a foothold here, that was smart on Megatron's part. I do wonder how long it took Sub-Atlantica to actually get to Washington, D.C. Obviously, it's going to take a massive amount of power to get it out of the ocean to the surface of the ocean, and then they've got to make it travel all the way to the land, and I'm just curious about how long it took. Did they have any power when they got there? Just something to think about. But overall, I think this is a pretty solid strategy by Megatron, and you can tell he's up in the ante every single episode. So once the Sub-Atlanticans get to the surface, we see they already are having some leadership problems with the Decepticons. Megatron wants to command some of these people, and they say, no, I don't take orders from you. And Megatron somehow coerces one of these people to actually do what he wants. But you can already tell we're like halfway through the episode. I'm not sure this is going to last. I mean, we kind of know that. And I think that the Sub-Atlanticans are smart not to trust the Decepticons, especially Megatron, and they are smart to have a plan B, because if they've been paying attention, which you have to assume that they have been underwater, they've had this plan that they're going to take over the surface, they have to know who the Decepticons are. They have to know at least something about Megatron. And so they're just covering their bases, and I think that that's very, very smart. Now, when they're in Washington, D.C., these battles break out everywhere, and I always talk about consequences here, but the Autobots say, quote, we don't want to harm any history. I think Hound says that. And right after he says that, he and Prowl hide behind the Washington Monument as they're getting shot. Not exactly the best way to protect the history. As a matter of fact, it's one of the reasons why the monument gets shot and nearly falls down. So, not the smartest move, although they had the best of intentions when doing it. Also, this episode brought up to me, it sort of, I guess, dredged up the thought that there have been at least 2 or 3 other instances within the episodes that we have watched and reviewed where the Autobots have had to go underwater and sort of use an underneath technique to get to wherever they need to go. Now, to be fair, it does matter for the Decepticon base because that is underwater, but there's a lot of underwater tunneling, a lot of underwater scuba diving that needs to be done in these episodes. And it just sort of kind of dawned on me in this episode here, something that I noted, and it's not necessarily a good or bad thing, just something that I've noted that this is sort of a trope that they've gone to more than once in the very few episodes that we've actually watched here. So Starscream really had a rough episode here. Can't seem to catch a break. I said earlier that in about 10-second time frame at the beginning of the episode, nearly dies twice. Goes down there, tries to stop Nurgle, ends up getting caught in the disruptor ray, and it's like, man, he really can't catch a break. And this time, he was actually trying to do something to benefit the Decepticons. Now, Bumblebee gets down there to go rescue Wheeljack, and this is when Starscream gets embarrassed by him because he is slightly incapacitated by the disruptor ray, and Bumblebee is able to sort of shove him off and really take him to task. And I'm like, what an embarrassment for Starscream. Now, I'm not sure if Starscream would have won a fair fight anyway against Bumblebee. We don't know, but you never want to be embarrassed. Nobody wants to be embarrassed in a fight. So the Autobots have been fighting this whole time, and then they call the Dinobots. Now, I ask a question here because I think it's relevant. In the last episode, I think we saw the Dinobots. They had proven themselves at Dinobot Island and said, you know what, you are part of the crew now. You can stay in the base with us. So when they left to go take care of all this stuff, why did they leave the Dinobots behind? They do this every time. I don't really understand this because they're now part of the crew. They should take them. They're the biggest, most powerful Autobots that we have, and yet they leave them there, and they only seem to use them when they really, really need them. And I mean when things are dire. And so Grimlock gets sort of an attitude about this, and I think it's justified here. But as they're waiting for the Dinobots to come here, Megatron is very proud of what happens. And again, a very cliched thing, but something I think Megatron would do because he loves power. He takes Abraham Lincoln off the Lincoln Memorial and sits in the chair. And that makes sense for Megatron. He would do something like that. But Grimlock shows up and says basically to Optimus Prime, I can't believe we have to save you again. And it's funny because Grimlock is cocky. I think Grimlock isn't the smartest when it comes to social cues, but he's definitely got some heel tendencies to him. And he definitely is willing to tell Optimus Prime when he's better than him. And this happens multiple times in this episode, especially at the end when they repair the Washington Monument. And through all this, to be fair to Starscream, and I've given Starscream a lot of crap this episode, he's had a rough episode, but Nurgle and the Sub-Atlanticans, they've really done nothing to show him anything other than betrayal. And so Starscream, when he attacks them after he gets out of the disruptor ray and everything, he obviously makes the plans go awry, but he has a good reason to do that, and Megatron was not privy to any of that. Now, as the Dinobots are doing their thing, the puns come back, and I think Optimus Prime says to them, time to act prehistoric. My goodness, that's bad. That's like even worse than a dad joke. But you know what? It's part of the show's allure, and it is what it is. Now, Megatron and Grimlock battle together, and I feel like if there's one note or one character development note to sort of talk about here, this episode really seemed to try to establish Grimlock as the firm leader. And I think it's funny, though, because he knows that the Dinobots are always there to save the butt of the Autobots, and he's cocky, I said that. But he has a reason to be cocky, because they are big, they're powerful, they always win, and in this case, they had to save the Autobots not once, but twice. So I think that's an interesting thing, and I think it's the only real character note that is something to, I guess, look at or maybe dive a little bit deeper into, because every episode this season, for the most part, has done some diving or some, I guess, character development of some type. So the Autobots and Decepticons, when the Earth is about ready to explode because Nurgle sets this whole chain reaction thing, they once again find themselves against the common enemy. And yet at the same time, they can't stop this guy, so this whole thing explodes, but they don't actually stop and ask themselves of all this battling that we're doing for some semblance of power, all it seems to do is lead us to need to unite so that we can stay alive. So why the hell are we fighting? But they're not going to do that. And at the end of the episode, we get, again, another Autobot thing where Prime and the Autobots, again, think they've heard the last of Nurgle, heard the last of the Sub-Atlanticans. And it's probably true in the sense of these are not characters that seem like they're going to come back in another episode. But my goodness, every time they say, we've seen the last of whatever it is, those things are right back there, especially if it's Megatron, especially if it's the Decepticons. They never seem to get it right. You cannot trust the Autobots' instinct in that regard. Overall, what did I think of the episode? It was campy and a little bit off the beaten path, so that's a good thing. There's only really so many ways in a show like this you can highlight the same character notes, so they're trying to do a little bit more, and season 2 they seem to be putting a little bit more emphasis and trying to do something different, and I appreciate that. In my opinion, the clear message of this episode was to show that Grimlock is the official leader of the Dinobots. They didn't say it, they didn't have to say it, it was just the way that it was presented. And there was a lot of battling happening in DC. Living here, it's not the biggest city in the world, and I wonder what kind of damage infrastructure-wise they did. Did they actually repair it? Were there consequences? We never see that, but it's something I want to continue to bring up because this whole episode was tons of battling, and it had to do a bunch of damage to a lot of close-knit buildings. And again, some of the character development with Grimlock, but otherwise, this episode was just another OG Transformers adventure. We did not see a Power Glide sighting. We did not see Warpath. We did not see any of the other Autobots that have been introduced. Very inconsistent in how they have been introduced, but you know what? We got a ton more episodes to go. Have you watched this episode lately? What did you think of it? I'd love to know. Email me some thoughts on the show. Email me some thoughts on this episode. mattyicemedia@gmail.com is the email address to do that. Or just email me to say, hey, Matt, listen to the show, love it, hate it, whatever. I'd love to hear from just one person who listens to this show. Next week, we're going to get into episode 10. We're going to keep rolling on. And even though I'm going to be on vacation here soon, I hope to have an episode queued up for you so that we don't miss any weeks and you get each of the reviews as we go on through season 2. Hope this finds everybody well, fam. I hope this finds everybody safe. I want to appreciate everybody's time. I'll talk to you next time. This is Energon Entries. The opinions and viewpoints expressed on Energon Entries are those of Matt Freitz and his guests and not necessarily those of the Matty Ice Media Network. Energon Entries is exclusively owned by Matt Freitz and is brought to you by the Matty Ice Media Network.